Carlos Castenada's The Eagle's Gift, Chapter 1, The Other Self. See if we can get her here. Hey, look at me. Well, you get the idea. The Other Self, Part 5, a Horde of Angry Sorcerers. And before I start this, I suggest if you have the time, there's a song on YouTube by Bob Dylan called Silvio. Give it a listen if you have a mind to. We were in the town at the crack of dawn. At that point, I took the wheel and drove toward the house. A couple of blocks before we got there, Lagorda asked me to stop. She got out of the car and began to walk on the high sidewalk. One by one, all of them got out. They followed Lagorda. Pablito came to my side and said that I should park on the plaza, which was a block away. I did that. The moment I saw Lagorda returning to the corner, I knew that something was wrong with her. She was extraordinarily pale. She came to me and said in a whisper that she was going to go to hear an early mass. Lydia also wanted to do that. Both of them walked across the plaza and went inside the church. Pablito, Nesta, and Benigno were as somber as I had ever seen them. Rosa was frightened, her mouth open, her eyes fixed, unblinking, looking in the direction of the house. Only Josefina was beaming. She gave me a buddy-buddy slap on the back. "You've done it, you son of a gun," she explained. "You've knocked the tar out of these sons of bitches." She laughed till she was nearly out of breath. "No, Daisy, you're not sitting with me, okay?" "Is this the place, Josefina?" I asked. It surely is," she said. "Lagorda used to go to the church all the time. She was a real churchgoer at the time." "Do you remember that house over there?" I asked, pointing to it. "That's Silvio Manuel's house," she said. All of us jumped upon hearing the name. I felt something similar to a mild shock of electric current going through my knees. The name was definitely not familiar to me, yet my body jumped upon hearing it. Silvio Manuel was such a rare name, so liquid a sound. The three Gennaros and Rosa were as perturbed as I was. I noticed that they were pale. Judging by what I felt, I must have been just as pale as they were. "Who is Silvio Manuel?" I finally managed to ask Josefina. "Now, you got me," she said. "I don't know." She reiterated that she was crazy and nothing that she said should be taken seriously. Nestor begged her to tell us whatever she remembered. Josefina tried to think, but she was not the person to perform well under pressure. I knew she would do better if no one asked her. I proposed that we look for a bakery or a place to eat. "They didn't let me do much in that house. That's what I remember," Josefina said all of a sudden. She turned around as if looking for something, or as if she were orientating herself. "Something is missing here," she explained. "This is not quite the way it used to be." I attempted to help her by asking questions that I deemed appropriate, such as whether the house was missing, or had been painted, or new ones built. But Josefina could not figure out how it was different. The crows are here. We walked to the bakery and brought sweet rolls. Yet as we were heading back to the plaza to wait for Lagorda and Lydia, Josefina suddenly hit her forehead, as if an idea had just struck her. "I know what's missing," she shouted. "That stupid wall of fog. It used to be here then. It's gone now." All of us spoke at once, asking her about the wall, but Josefina went on talking undisturbed, as if we were not there. "It was a wall of fog that went all the way up to the sky," she said. "It was right here. Every time I turned my head, there it was. It drove me crazy. That's right, damn it. I wasn't nuts until I was driven crazy by that wall. I saw it with my eyes closed or with my eyes open. I thought the wall was after me." For a moment, Josefina lost her natural vivaciousness. A desperate look appeared in her eyes. I had seen that look in people who were going through psychotic episodes. I hurriedly suggested that she eat her sweet roll. She calmed down immediately and began to eat it. What do you think of all of this, Nestor?" I asked. "I'm scared," he said softly. "Do you remember anything?" He shook his head negatively. I questioned Pablito and Benigno with a movement of my brows. They also shook their heads to say no. "How about you, Rosa?" I asked. Rosa jumped when she heard me addressing her. She seemed to have lost her speech. She held a sweet roll in her hand and stared at it, seemingly undecided to do what to do with it. "Of course she remembers," Josephina said, laughing. "But she's frightened to death. Can't you see that the piss is even coming out of her ears?" Josephina seemed to think her statement was the ultimate joke. She doubled up laughing and dropped her roll on the ground. She picked it up, dusted it off, and ate it. "Crazy people eat anything," she said, slapping me on the back. Nestor and Benigno seemed to be uncomfortable with Josephina's antics. Pablito was delighted. There was a look of admiration in his eyes. He shook his head and clicked his tongue as if he could not believe such grace. "Let's go to the house," Josephina urged us. "I'll tell you all kinds of things there." I said that we should wait for Lagorda and Lydia. Besides, it was still too early to bother the charming lady who lived there. Pablito said that in the course of his carpentry business he had been in that town and knew a house where people prepared food for transient people. Josephina did not want to wait. For her it was either going to the house or going to eat. I opted for having breakfast and told Rosa to go into the church to get Lagorda and Lydia. But Benigno gallantly volunteered to wait for them and take them to the breakfast place. Apparently he knew where the place was. "All right, Daisy, no jumping up." Pablito did not take us directly there. Instead, at my request, he made a long detour. There was an old bridge at the edge of town that I wanted to examine. I had seen it from my car the day I had come with Lagorda. Its structure seemed to be colonial. We went out on the bridge and then stopped abruptly in the middle of it. I asked the man who was standing there if the bridge was very old. He said that he had seen it all his life, and he was over 50. I thought that the bridge held a unique fascination for me alone, but watching the others, I had to conclude that they too had been affected by it. Nestor and Rosa were panting out of breath. Pablito was holding on to Josephina. She, in turn, was holding on to me. "Do you remember anything, Josephina?" I asked. "That devil Silvio Manuel is on the other side of this bridge," she said, pointing to the other end, some 30 feet away. I looked Rosa in the eye. She nodded her head affirmatively and whispered that she had once crossed the bridge in great fear and that something had been waiting to devour her at the other end. The two men were no help. They looked at me bewildered. Each said that he was afraid for no reason. I had to agree with them. I felt I would not dare cross that bridge at night for all the money in the world. I did not know why. "What else do you remember, Josephina?" I asked. "My body is very frightened now," she said. "I can't remember anything. That devil Silvio Manuel is always in the darkness. Ask Rosa." With a movement of my head, I invited Rosa to talk. She nodded affirmatively 3 or 4 times, but could not vocalize her words. The tension I myself was experiencing was uncalled for, yet real. All of us were standing on that bridge, midway across, incapable of taking one more step in the direction Josephina had pointed. At last, Josephina took the initiative and turned around. We walked back to the center of town. Pablito guided us then to a large house. Lagorda, Lydia, and Benigno were already eating. They had even ordered food for us. I was not hungry. Pablito, Nestor, and Rosa were in a daze. Josephina ate heartily. There was an ominous silence at the table. Everybody avoided my eyes when I tried to start a conversation. After breakfast, we walked to the house. No one said a word. I knocked, and when the lady came out, I explained to her that I wanted to show her house to my friends. She hesitated for a moment. Lagorda gave her some money and apologized for inconveniencing her. Josephina led us directly to the back. I had not seen that part of the house when I was there before. There was a cobbled courtyard with rooms arranged around it. Bulky farm equipment was stored away in the roofed corridors. I had the feeling that I had seen that courtyard when there was no clutter in it. There were 8 rooms, 2 on each of the 4 sides of the courtyard. Nesta, Pablito, and Benigno seemed to be on the brink of getting physically ill. Lagorda was perspiring profusely. She sat down with Josephina in an alcove in one of the walls, while Lydia and Rosa went inside one of the rooms. Suddenly, Nesta seemed to have an urge to find something and disappeared into one of those rooms. So did Pablito and Benigno. I was left alone with the lady. I wanted to talk to her, ask her questions, see if she knew Silvio Manuel, but I could not muster the energy to talk. My stomach was in knots. My hands were dripping perspiration. What oppressed me was an intangible sadness, a longing for something not present, unformulated. I could not stand it. I was about to say goodbye to the lady and walk out of the house when Lagorda came to my side. She whispered that we should sit down in a large room off the hall separate from the courtyard. The room was visible from where we were standing. We went there and stepped inside. It was very large, empty room with a high beam ceiling, dark but airy. Lagorda called everyone to the room. The lady just looked at us, but did not come in herself. Everyone seemed to know precisely where to sit. The Gennaro sat to the right of the door on one side of the room, and Lagorda and the 3 little sisters sat to the left on the other side. They sat close to the walls. Although I would have liked to sit next to Lagorda, I sat near the center of the room. The place seemed right for me. I did not know why, but an ulterior order seemed to have determined our places. While I sat there, a wave of strange feelings rolled over me. I was passive and relaxed. I fancied myself to be like a moving picture screen on which alien feelings of sadness and longing were being projected. But there was nothing I could recognize as a precise memory. We stayed in that room for over an hour. Toward the end, I felt I was about to uncover the source of the unearthly sadness that was making me weep almost without control. But then, as involuntarily as we had sat there, we stood up and left the house. We did not even thank the lady or say goodbye to her. We congregated in the plaza. Lagorda stated right away that because she was formless, she was still in charge. She said that she was taking this stand because of conclusions she had reached in Silvio Manuel's house. Lagorda seemed to be waiting for comments. The silence of the others was unbearable to me. I finally had to say something. "What are the conclusions you reached in that house, Lagorda?" I asked. "I think we all know what they are," she replied in a haughty tone. We don't know that," I said. "Nobody has said anything yet." We don't have to talk. We know," Lagorda said. I insisted that I could not take such an important event for granted. I needed to talk about our feelings. As far as I was concerned, all I had gotten out of it was a devastating sense of sadness and despair. "The narwhal Juan Mateus was right," Lagorda said. "We had to sit on the place of power to be free. I am free now. I don't know how it happened, but something was lifted off me as I sat there." The 3 women agreed with her. The 3 men did not. Nestor said that he had been about to remember actual faces, but that no matter how hard he had tried to clear his view, something thwarted him. All he had experienced was a sense of longing and sadness at finding himself still in the world. Pablito and Benigno said more or less the same thing. "See what I mean, Gorda?" I said. She sensed She seemed displeased. She puffed up as if I had never seen her, or had I seen her all puffed up before somewhere. She harangued the group. I could not pay attention to what she was saying. I was immersed in a memory that was formless, but also within my grasp. To keep it going, it seemed that I needed a continuous flow from Lagorda. I was fixed on the sound of her voice, her anger. At a certain moment, when she was becoming more subdued, I yelled at her that she was bossy. She got truly upset. I watched her for a while. I was remembering another Lagorda. Another time, an angry, fat Gorda pounding her fist on my chest. I remembered laughing at seeing her angry, humoring her like a child. The memory ended the moment Lagorda's voice stopped. She seemed to have realized what I was doing. I addressed all of them and told them we were in a precarious position. Something unknown was looming over us. "It's not looming over us," Lagorda said dryly. "It's hit us already. I think you know what it is." "I don't. I think I'm also speaking for the rest of the men," I said. The 3 Janeros assented with a nod. "We have lived in that house while we were on the left side," Lagorda explained. "I used to sit in that alcove to cry because I couldn't figure out what to do. I think if I could have stayed in that room a bit longer today, I would have remembered it all. But something pushed me out of there. I also used to sit in that room when there were more people in there. I couldn't remember their faces, though. Yet other things became clear as I sat there today. I am formless. Things come to me, good and bad. I, for instance, picked up my old arrogance and my desire to brood. But I also picked up other things, good things." "Me too," Lydia said in a raspy voice. "What are the good things?" I asked. I think I'm wrong in hating you," Lydia said. "My hatred will keep me from flying away. They told me that in that room, the men there, the men there and the women." "What men and what women?" Nesta asked in a tone of fright. "I was there when they were there, and that's all I know," Lydia said. "You also were there. All of us were there." "Who were the men and women, Lydia?" I asked. "I was there when they were there. That's all I know," she repeated. "How about you, Gorda?" I asked. I've told you already that I can't remember any faces or anything specific," she said. "But I know one thing. Whatever we did in that house was on the left side. We crossed or somebody made us cross over the parallel lines. The weird memories we have come from that time, from that world. Without any verbal agreement, we left the plaza and headed for the bridge. Lagorda and Lydia ran ahead of us. When we got there, we found both of them standing exactly where we ourselves had stopped earlier. "Silvio Manuel is the darkness," Lagorda whispered to me, her eyes fixed on the other end of the bridge. Lydia was shaking. She also tried to talk to me. I could not understand what she was mouthing. I pulled everyone back away from the bridge. I thought that perhaps if we could piece together what we knew about that place, we might have a composite that would help us understand our dilemma. We sat on the ground a few yards away from the bridge. There were lots of people milling around, but no one paid any attention to us. "Who's Silvio Manuel, Gorda?" I asked. "I'd never heard the name until now," she said. I don't know the man, yet I know him. Something like waves come upon me when I heard the name. Josefina told me the name when we were in the house. From that moment on, things have started to come to my mind and to my mouth, just like Josefina. I never thought I would live to find myself being like Josefina." Why did you say that Silvio Manuel is the darkness?" I asked. "I have no idea," she said. "Yet all of us here know that is the truth." She urged the women to speak up. No one uttered a word. I picked on Rosa. She had been about to say something 3 or 4 times. I accused her of holding out on us. Her little body convulsed. We crossed this bridge, and Silvio Manuel waited for us at the other end, she said in a voice barely audible. I went last. When we were devoured, the others I heard their screams. I wanted to run away, but the devil Silvio Manuel was at both ends of the bridge. There was no way to escape. LaGuardia, Lydia, and Josephina agreed. I asked whether I was just feeling that. I asked whether it was just a feeling that they had or an actual moment-to-moment memory of something. LaGuardia said that for her it had been exactly as Rosa had described it, a moment-to-moment memory. The other two agreed with her. I wondered aloud what had happened with the people who lived around the bridge. If the women were screaming as Rosa said they were, the passerby must have heard them. Screaming would have caused a commotion. For a moment I felt that the whole town must have collaborated in some plot. A chill ran through me. I turned to Nesta and bluntly expressed a full scope of my fear. Nesta said that the Nahual Juan Mateus and Gennaro were indeed warriors of supreme accomplishment, and as such they were solitary beings. Their contacts with people were one-to-one. There was no possibility that the entire town, or even the people who lived around the bridge, were in collusion with them. For that to happen, Nesta said, all those people would have to be warriors, a most unlikely possibility. Josephina began to circle me, looking me up and down with a sneer. You certainly have gall, she said, pretending that you don't know anything, when you were here yourself. You brought us here. You pushed us onto this bridge. The eyes of the woman became menacing. I turned to Nesta for assistance. I don't remember a thing, he said. This place scares me. That's all I know. Turning to Nesta was an excellent maneuver on my part. The woman lashed out at him. Of course you remember, Josephina yelled. All of us were here. What kind of stupid ass are you? My inquiry required a sense of order. I moved them away from the bridge. I thought that, being the active persons they would find it more relaxing to stroll and talk things out rather than sitting, as I would have preferred. As we walked, the women's anger vanished, and as quickly as it had come, Lydia and Josephina became even more talkative. They stated over and over the sense that they had that Silvio Manuel was awesome. Nevertheless, neither of them could remember being physically hurt. They only remembered being paralyzed by fear. Rosa did not say a word, but gestured her agreement with everything the others said. I asked them if it had been night when they tried to cross the bridge. Both Lydia and Josephina said that it was daytime. Rosa cleared her throat and whispered that it was at night. LaGuardia clarified the discrepancy, explaining that it had been the morning twilight or just before. We reached the end of the short street and automatically turned back to the bridge. It's simplicity itself, LaGuardia said suddenly, as if she had just thought it through. We were crossing, or rather Silvio Manuel was making us cross the parallel lines. That bridge is a power spot, a hole in this world, a door to the other. We went through it. It must have hurt us to go through, because my body is scared. Silvio Manuel was waiting for us on the other side. None of us remembers his face, because Silvio Manuel is the darkness, and never would he show us his face. We could only see his eyes. One eye, Rosa said quietly, and looked away. Everyone here, including you, LaGuardia said to me, knows that Silvio Manuel's face is in darkness, or one could only hear his voice, soft like muffled coughing. LaGuardia stopped talking and began to scrutinize me in a way that made me feel self-conscious. Her eyes were cagey. She gave me the impression that she was holding back something she knew. I asked her. She denied it, but she admitted having scores of feelings with no foundation that she did not care to explain. I urged her then I urged and then demanded that the women make an effort to recollect what had happened to them on the other side of that bridge. Each of them could only remember hearing the screams of the others. The three Janeros remained outside our discussion. I asked Nestor if he had any idea what had happened. His somber answer was that all of it was beyond his understanding. I came then to a quick decision. It seemed to me that the only avenue open to us was to cross that bridge. I rallied them to walk back to the bridge and go over it as a group. The men agreed instantaneously. The women did not. After exhausting all my reasonings, I finally had to push and drag Lydia, Rosa, and Josephina. LaGuardia was reluctant to go, but seemed intrigued by the prospect. She moved along without helping me with the women, and so did the Janeros. They giggled nervously at my efforts to herd the little sisters, but they did not move a finger to help. We walked up to the point where we had stopped earlier. I felt there that I was suddenly too weak to hold the three women. I yelled at LaGuardia to help. She made a half-hearted attempt to catch Lydia as the group lost its cohesion, and every one of them, except LaGuardia, scrambled, stumping and puffing, to the safety of the street. LaGuardia and I stayed as if we were glued to that bridge, incapable of going forward and begrudging having to retreat. LaGuardia whispered in my ear that I should not be afraid at all, because it had actually been I who had been waiting for them on the other side. She added that she was convinced that I knew I was Silvio Manuel's helper, and that I did not dare to reveal it to anyone. Right then, a fury beyond my control shook my body. I felt that LaGuardia had no business making those remarks or having those feelings. I grabbed her by the hair and twirled her around. I caught myself at the apex of my wrath and stopped. I apologized and hugged her. A sober thought came to my rescue. I said to her that being a leader was getting on my nerves, and tension was becoming more and more acute as we proceeded. She did not agree with me. She held on steadfastly to her interpretation that Silvio Manuel and I were utterly close, and that upon being reminded of my master, I had reacted with anger. I was lucky that she had been entrusted to my care, she said. Otherwise, I probably would have thrown her off the bridge. We turned back. The rest of them were safely off the bridge, staring at us with unmistakable fear. A very peculiar state of timelessness seemed to prevail. There were no people around. We must have been on that bridge for at least 5 minutes, and not a single person had crossed it or had even come in sight. Then all of a sudden, people were moving around us as on any thoroughfare during the busy hours. Without a word, we walked back to the plaza. We were dangerously weak. I had a vague desire to remain in town a bit longer, but we got in the car and drove east, toward the Atlantic coast. Nestor and I took turns driving, stopping only for gasoline and to eat, until we reached Veracruz. That city was neutral ground for us. I had been there only once. None of the others had ever been there. LaGuardia believed that such an unknown city was the proper place to shed their old wrappings. We checked into a hotel, and there they proceeded to rip their old clothes to shreds. The excitation of a new city did wonders for their morale and their feeling of well-being. Our next stop was Mexico City. We stayed at the hotel by the Alameda Park where Don Juan and I had once stayed. For 2 days, we were perfect tourists. We shopped and visited as many tourist spots as possible. The woman looked simply stunning. Benigno bought a camera in a pawn shop. He took 425 shots without any film. At one place, while we were admiring the stupendous mosaics on the walls, a security guard asked me where those gorgeous foreign women were from. He assumed I was a tourist guide. I told him they were from Sri Lanka. He believed me and marveled at the fact that they looked so Mexican. The following day, at 10 o'clock in the morning, we were at the airline office into which Don Juan had once pushed me. When he shoved me, I had gone in through one door, but came out through another, not to the street as I should have, but to a market at least a mile away, where I had watched the activities of other people there. LaGuardia speculated that the airline office was also like that bridge, a power spot, a door to cross from one parallel line to the other. She said that evidently the narwhal had pushed me through that opening, but I got caught midway between the two worlds, in between the lines. Thus I had been in two worlds, in between. I had watched the activity in the market without being part of it. She said that the narwhal, of course, had intended to push me all the way through, but my willfulness thwarted me, and I ended up back on the line I came from, this world. We walked from the airline office to the market, and from there to Almeida Park, where Don Juan and I had sat after our experience at the office. I had been in that park with Don Juan many times. I felt the most appropriate place to talk about the course of our I felt that it was the most appropriate place to talk about the course of our future actions. It was my intention to summarize everything we had done in order to let the power of that place decide what our next steps would be. After our deliberate attempt at crossing the bridge, I had tried unsuccessfully to think out a way to handle my companions as a group. We sat on some stone steps, and I started off with the idea that for me, knowledge was fused with words. I told them that it was my earnest belief that if an event or experience was not formulated into a concept, it was condemned to dissipate. I asked them, therefore, to give me their individual assessments of our situation. Pablito was the first one to talk. I found that odd, since he had been extraordinarily quiet up until now. He apologized because he was going to say what he was going to say was not something he had remembered or felt, but a conclusion based on everything he knew. He said that he saw no problem in understanding what the women said had happened on the bridge. It had been, Pablito maintained, a matter of being compelled to cross from the right side, the tonal, to the left side, the narwhal. What had scared everyone was the fact that someone else was in control, forcing the crossing. He saw no problem either in accepting that I had been the one who had then helped Silvio Manuel. He backed up his conclusion with the statement that only 2 days earlier he had seen me doing the same thing, pushing everyone onto the bridge. Thus I had no one to help me on the other side, no Silvio Manuel to pull them. I tried to change the topic and began to explain to them that to forget the way we had forgotten was called amnesia. The little I knew about amnesia was not enough to shed any light on our case, but enough to make me believe that we could not forget as if on command. I told them that someone, possibly Don Juan, must have done something unfathomable to us. I wanted to find out exactly what it had been. Pablito insisted that it was important for me to understand that it was I who had been in cahoots with Silvio Manuel. He intimated that Lydia and Josefina had talked to him about the role I played in forcing them to cross the parallel lines. I did not feel comfortable discussing the subject. I commented that I had never heard about the parallel lines until the day I spoke with Donna Soledad. Yet I had no qualms about immediately adopting the idea. I told them that I knew in a flash what she meant. I even became convinced I had crossed them myself when I thought I remembered her. Every one of the others, with the exception of LaGuardia, said that the first time they had heard about the parallel lines was when I spoke of them. LaGuardia said that she had first learned about them from Donna Soledad just before I did. Pablito made an attempt to talk about my relationship with Silvio Manuel. I interrupted him. I said that while all of us were at the bridge trying to cross it, I had failed to recognize that I, and presumably all of them, had entered into a state of non-ordinary reality. I only became aware of the change when I realized there were no other people on the bridge. All 8 of us had stood there. It had been a clear day, but suddenly the skies became cloudy and the light of the mid-morning turned to dusk. I had been so busy with my fears and personalistic interpretations that I had failed to notice the awesome change. When we retreated from the bridge, I perceived that the other people were again walking around. But what had happened to them when we were attempting our crossing? LaGuardia and the rest of them had not noticed anything. In fact, they had not been aware of any changes until the very moment I described them. All of them stared at me with a mixture of annoyance and fear. Pablito again took the lead and accused me of trying to railroad them into something they did not want. He was not specific about what that might be, but his elegance was enough to rally the others behind him. Suddenly I had a horde of angry sorcerers on me. It took me a long time to explain my need to examine from every possible point of view something so strange and engulfing as our experience on the bridge. They finally calmed down, not so much because they were convinced, but from emotional fatigue. All of them, LaGuardia included, had vehemently supported Pablito's stand. Nestor advanced another line of reasoning. He suggested that I was possibly an unwilling envoy who did not fully realize the scope of my actions. He added that he could not bring himself to believe, as the others did, that I was aware that I had been left with the task of misleading them. He felt that I did not really know that I was leading them to their destruction, yet I was doing just that. He thought that there were 2 ways of crossing the parallel lines, one by means of someone else's power, and the other by one's own power. His final conclusion was that Silvio Manuel had made them cross by frightening them so intensely that some of them did not even remember having done it. The task left for them to accomplish was to cross on their own power. Mine was to thwart them. Benigno spoke then. He said that in his opinion, the last thing Don Juan did to the male apprentices was to help us cross the parallel lines by making us jump into an abyss. Benigno believed that we already had a great deal of knowledge about the crossing, but that it was not yet time to accomplish it again. At the bridge, they were incapable of taking one more step because the time was not right. They were correct, therefore, in believing that I had tried to destroy them by forcing them to cross. He thought that going over the parallel lines in full awareness meant a final step for all of them, a step to be taken only when they were ready to disappear from this earth. Lydia faced me next. She did not make any assessments, but challenged me to remember how I had first lured her to the bridge. She blatantly stated that I was not the Narwhal Mateus's apprentice, but Silvio Manuel's, and that Silvio Manuel and I had devoured each other's bodies. I had another attack of rage, as with LaGuardia and the bridge. I caught myself this time. A logical thought calmed me. I said to myself over and over that I was interested in analysis. I explained to Lydia that it was useless to taunt me like that. She did not want to stop. She yelled that Silvio Manuel was my master, and that this was the reason I was not part of them at all. Rosa added that Silvio Manuel gave me everything I was. I questioned Rosa's choice of words. I told her that she should have said that Silvio Manuel gave me everything I had. She defended her wording. Silvio Manuel had given me what I was. Even LaGuardia backed her up and said that she remembered at a time when I had gotten so ill that I had no resources left. Everything in me was so exhausted that it was then that Silvio Manuel had taken over and pumped new life into my body. LaGuardia said that I was indeed better off knowing my true origins, that proceeding as I had done so far on the assumption that it was not the Nahual Juan Mateus who had helped me. She insisted that I was fixed on the Nahual because of his predilection for words. Silvio Manuel, on the other hand, was the silent darkness. She explained that in order to follow him, I would need to cross the parallel lines. But to follow the Nahual Juan Mateus, all I needed to do was to talk about him. What they were saying was nothing but nonsense to me. I was about to make what I thought was a good point about when my line of reasoning became literally scrambled. I could not think what my point had been, although only a second before it was clarity itself. Instead, a most curious memory beset me. It was not a feeling of something, but the actual hard memory of an event. I remembered that once I was with Don Juan and another man whose face I could not remember. The three of us were talking about something I was perceiving as a feature of the world. It was 3 or 4 yards to my right, and it was an inconceivable bank of yellowish fog, as far as I could tell, divided the world in two. It went from the ground up to the sky to infinity. While I talked to the two men, the half of the world to my left was intact. The half to my right was veiled in fog. I remembered that I had orientated myself with the aid of the landmarks and realized that the axis of the bank of fog went from east to west. Everything to the north of that line was the world as I knew it. I remembered asking Don Juan what had happened to the world south of the line. Don Juan made me turn a few degrees to my right, and I saw the wall of fog move as I turned my head. The world was divided in two at a level my intellect could not comprehend. The division seemed real, but the boundary was not a physical one. It had been somehow in myself. Or was it? There's still one more facet to this memory. The other man said that it was a great accomplishment to divide the world in two, but it was even a greater accomplishment when a warrior had the serenity and control to stop the rotation of the wall. He said that the wall was not inside us. It was certainly out in the world, dividing it in two, and rotating when we moved our heads, as if we were stuck to our own right temples. The great accomplishment of keeping the wall from turning enabled the warriors to face the wall and gave them the power to go through it any time he so desired. When I told the apprentices what I had just remembered, the women were convinced that the other man was Silvio Manuel. Josefina was connoisseur of the wall of fog, explained that the advantage Eligio had over everyone else was his capacity to make the wall stand still so he could go through it at will. She added that it is easier to pierce the wall of fog in dreaming because it does not move. LaGuardia seemed to be touched by my series of perhaps painful memories. Her body jumped involuntarily until finally she exploded into words. She said that it was no longer possible for her to deny the fact that I was Silvio Manuel's helper. The Narwhal himself had warned her that I would enslave her if she was not careful. Even Soledad had told her to watch me, because my spirit took prisoners and kept them as servants, a thing only Silvio Manuel would do. He had enslaved me, and I in turn would enslave anyone who came close to me. She asserted that she had lived under my spell up to the moment she sat in that room in Silvio Manuel's house, when something was suddenly lifted off her shoulders. I stood up and literally staggered under the impact of Lagorda's words. There was a vacuum in my stomach. I had been convinced that I could count on her for support under any conditions. I felt betrayed. I thought it would be appropriate to let her know my feelings. But a sense of sobriety came to my rescue. I told them, instead, that it had been my dispassionate conclusion, as a warrior, that Don Juan had changed the course of my life for the better. I had assessed over and over what he had done to me, and the conclusions had always been the same, that he had brought me freedom. Freedom was all I knew, all I could bring to anyone who might come to me. Nesta made a gesture of solidarity with me. He exhorted to the women to abandon their animosity toward me. He looked at me with the eyes of one who does not understand but wants to. He said that I did not belong with them, that I was indeed a solitary bird. They had needed me for a moment in order to break their boundaries of affection and routine. Now that they were free, the sky was their limit. To remain with me would doubtlessly be pleasant, but deadly for them. He seemed to be deeply moved. He came to my side and put his hand on my shoulder. He said that he had the feeling that we were not going to see each other ever again on this earth. He regretted that we were going to part, like petty people, bickering, complaining, accusing. He told me that, speaking on behalf of the others, but not for himself, he was going to ask me to leave, for we had no more possibilities in being together. He added he had laughed at Lagorda for telling us about the snake we had formed. He had changed his mind and no longer found the idea ridiculous. It had been our last opportunity to succeed as a group. Don Juan had taught me to accept my fate in humbleness. The course of a warrior's destiny is unalterable, he had once said to me. The challenge is how far he can go within those rigid bounds, how impeccable he can be with those rigid bounds. If there are obstacles in his path, the warrior strives impeccably to overcome them. He finds unbearable hardship and pain on his path. He weeps, but all his tears are put together. All his tears put together could not move the line of his destiny, the breath of one hair. My original decision to let the power of that place point out our next step had been correct. I stood up. The others turned their heads away. Lagorda came to my side and said, as if nothing had happened, that I should leave and that she would catch up with me and join me a little later. I wanted to retort that I saw no reason for her to join me. She had chosen to join the others. She seemed to read my feelings of having been betrayed. She calmly assured me that we had to fulfill our fate together as warriors and not as the petty people we were. End of chapter.